So Civil War, this is now, I believe, the fourth directorial feature film from director Alex
Hmm.
Garland. He certainly is one of the more interesting filmmakers working today, I would say. He got his career started really writing and doing a lot of screenwriting, of course, with the 28 Days Later franchise, which he's actually going to be returning to really soon here, a
Hmm.
part of this new trilogy that we'll talk about a little bit later in the news. But he eventually ventured into directing his own feature films and started off with Ex Machina before making Annihilation, Men, which came out a couple of years ago and we talked about on the podcast. And now he's returned with Civil War, which may be the last movie that he ever directs. I'm not entirely sure, but he's certainly talking that he might step away from directing and still just be a screenwriter for the most part. But be that as it may, we got a chance to check out this movie this past weekend in IMAX. This is a more traditional IMAX rollout from A24. They have certainly leaned into making more big budget movies moving ahead, and this is one of their first big efforts at doing so. And so we checked this movie out in IMAX this past weekend. So with all of that out the way, man, I will pass it over to you. What did you think about Alex Garland's new film, Civil War?
You know what? It always doesn't work out, but what I like about Alex Garland is he's always trying to say something, or always trying to give a warning about something relevant to society, whether it's Ex Machina and the talking about AI and in this new I guess convergence of technology surrounding AI, which is crazy because when that movie came out, we weren't talking about AI as much as we are now. You know, it's almost like he was having that conversation before people really got into the nitty gritty. Annihilation, really, just about the environment and Earth and things like that. And now here, Civil War, man, about this just overarching political, I guess, really about polarizing politics in America. And I think I just like that as a filmmaker, he always goes after those topics because a lot of people don't. And yeah, he always makes sure that his movies say something or mean something and are relevant. So I've always appreciated Alex Garland for that, even though I don't like Men too much. Men is like, I don't know what you're doing there, buddy. But that being said, man, I like Civil War. I like this conversation around polarizing politics, especially given the nature of what's going down in Gaza with Palestine. Today, Civil War. What's so interesting about the film is there's nothing. It's not necessarily a movie that's going to hold your hand and tell you what's going on in the movie. There is, oh, yes, there's a civil war, but technically you don't know why it went down. All you know was that the president is a fascist, and to me, that's all you need to know. That's really all you need to really understand. I think to grasp this movie and to enter, I think, this world that seems all too realistic with Civil War. As a photographer, this movie is very interesting to me because it does take the gaze and it is a movie from the perspective of photojournalists who are military embedded, and they literally are driving through mainly eastern, a little bit of western, but mainly eastern parts of New York, trying to get to DC to literally interview the president. And it is just mayhem as again, this world is so weird. You could tell there's been a lot of people dying, there's been a lot of mayhem and anarchy. It's just been a lot going on, but I really like the overlooming feel that this movie gives, where again, you don't know exactly what's happening, but you actually understand the perfect amount to make your own assumptions about what's going down. And so I really like that about it. I really like the photojournalism approach, because that's not something we always talk about. People usually, discuss journalism in a lot in the written way. We don't also always talk about the photojournalism way. So I really like that they took the approach to look at this world from that lens, pun intended, as well. But it's good, man. It doesn't shy away from anything. This movie is very violent. This movie is extra trigger warning. I think it's crazy. Some of the imagery you see is scary. It is vibrant in a in and sometimes it's scary that it's vibrant. There's a couple moments in the movie where Alex Garland makes something so disastrous look beautiful, and it's like, wow, why does this look like this? Like it's very interesting concept, I think, to wrap around in my mind. Like, man, why would you make something so horrifying look so beautiful? But I think again, the story he's trying to tell, it also kind of makes sense in some ways. Shout out to Kirsten Dunst. I think she did a tremendous job And shout out to what's her name, Callie,
Kaylee.
Kaylee. Man, Kaylee Spaney. I think even though she is technically an annoying character, she's kind of supposed to be. But in that way, I think she also kind of steals the show, being just a very important character who I think hit a lot of the right beats. The only thing about this film that I really takes away from it is some of the character beats towards the end. I just had a couple questions about. Like, I don't know if if some of those things should have went in that direction. I don't know if that part was completely believable by the end of it. But I think overall, man, between what Alex Garland is trying to say, between this movie being from the perspective of photojournalism, the realistic nature of it all, and the timing of it all, I really enjoyed this movie. And I think Civil War, in the future, when more people get to see this movie, is going to be something we talk about for a while because of how well timed it is. I think for what we have going on in this country and really in the world.
First of all, I want to say that I think if you've seen trailers and marketing for Civil War, just disregard a lot of that because this movie is not what you think it is. I think it goes in completely different directions than how they present it in the marketing, which is not a bad thing. You have to make people want to come and see this and make it appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what the marketing presents it as is a war movie. And there's certainly a war element to it that's all throughout the movie, but it's about, a little bit more than that. And I think overall with Civil War, after I left the movies and just thought about it a lot, I walked away really loving this movie in quite a few different ways just because of the visceral nature of it and just how much it makes you feel as you're watching. It's certainly an experience that will leave you a bit frightened just considering what all transpires throughout the movie. First and foremost, I think from a technical standpoint, this is probably Alex Garland's best movie. I think he's only gotten better as an actual filmmaker. I'm not sure if his stories always follow that progression, but I think from a technical standpoint and from a filmmaking
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, his movies have just gotten better. And of course, he had much more in terms of resources with this film because it's the largest budgeted film that he's worked on. It's the largest budgeted A24 movie. So he had a lot more to work with, and he also had a little bit of star power as well in here with Kirsten Dunst. And I think just from a technical standpoint, creating this dystopian America that isn't that far away. It feels very connected to the future. It feels like that this is maybe 5 years in the future at most. But to create this sense of scale and this dystopia America that feels so realistic and feels like it's very much in our backyard was just a tremendous feat of filmmaking. And then those specific sequences that happen in the movie where you're following these photojournalists across the country, they come across so many different scenarios and so many situations where there are near death experiences, there's horrific sights,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of violence that occurs. And the way that the violence is communicated on screen, I think is just so well done because you feel very much right in the middle of it. It feels so immersive. And I think that that's why this is a really great movie to see in IMAX because they certainly use that sound and that format to certainly make you feel like you're right there. Anytime that there's a gunshot in this movie, it feels as loud and as
Mm-hmm.
real as a gunshot feels. And I've shot a gun. Those things are ridiculously loud. And at the points that they deploy them in this movie, it's just so well done. And I love that because it never takes any of those moments for granted. Maybe until the very end. And at the end of this movie, it becomes like a full scale battle. But for the most part, they mostly are reserved in their tactics and how they deploy the violence and the sounds of guns and things of that nature. But I think one of the interesting things about this movie, and you talked about it a little bit, just the vague nature of the scenario and what's really going on here. You don't really have the information as to how we got to this place, and I think that that's intentional because of the simple fact that we are following these photojournalists who are supposed to be sort of impartial to all of this. They're really there to
Mm-hmm.
document what's occurring on the ground. And I think as a viewer and as an audience member, we're not really meant to choose and take sides in this issue because we don't have all the information there.
Mm-hmm.
And to that extent, there's this, this big conversation around the movie going around right now. Is it apolitical? Is it not apolitical? I think it absolutely is. I think that that's the entire point of the movie is that you're not supposed to necessarily bring your politics to it because it's about more than
Mm-hmm.
that. It's about the brutality that Americans are willing to inflict on one another when shit gets crazy in the country. Like it becomes no holds barred. It becomes all hands on deck for a countrywide conflict that's obviously taking place here. And I think that that brutality is depicted in almost every scene throughout this movie where you're just seeing both sides of this conflict move in very morally ambiguous and questionable ways. There's just
Yeah.
moments where it's like, I can't pick who's a good guy or a bad guy, quote unquote, here, because everybody's doing stuff that's super questionable, especially at the
Hmm.
end of the movie when you feel a certain type of way maybe about the president, and then you see what happens, and it's like, well, damn, that's a really striking ending. I don't know how to feel about that. And I think that that's the point of the movie, is to get you to question that, but then also to understand, as journalists who are on the ground, the psychology of what they go through, the choices that they make, and highlighting the importance of them, but I think also, to a certain extent, condemning them as well. This movie also condemns photojournalism in a way, because one of the characters is an asshole. Like, Wagner Moore's character is not necessarily a great guy in this movie, and the way that he
Hmm.
moves and what he wants to achieve, it's questionable, and what he's willing to do to get there is very questionable. So I think it also plays with the morality of photojournalists and the people that are supposed to be impartial, but also their role in this entire conflict as well. So overall, I just really enjoyed it for those things. It certainly feels like a mesh of multiple things. I think it's similar. It's similar to Apocalypse Now, another classic war movie, in the
Hmm.
sense that it's episodic in nature. If you watch
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now, the characters just encounter enemies and near death experiences over and over and over again. And you don't really understand what's happening. You don't understand all of what's happening behind the scenes. And that's not the point. It's to just showcase the horror of the Vietnam War. But then you also add in, I think, what this movie is also in conversation with. It's kind of funny, the timing of it. A movie we just talked about a little bit with the Academy Awards, 20 Days of Mariupol, which is
Hmm.
about photojournalism, or about video journalism on the ground, in a real life experience of what's happening between Russia and the Ukraine. And that film is extraordinary because of what it does to showcase that violence and the horrific nature of that conflict, and what happened 2 years ago. And I think that in examining that, and examining, as you pointed out earlier, with what's happening in Gaza, but then just also knowing like what's happening in our own country, and the fact that
Hmm.
we just had an insurrection happen like a couple of years ago, this stuff will certainly make you feel a way, and I think it'll frighten you, and it frightened me just watching this movie, because it just felt so real, and it felt so immediate as well. And I think that it's a big home run in that way. Of course, it's going to be divisive, because there is political underpinnings and tonalities and things that are addressed here. And also, to be fair, I think that a lot of the characters that we follow, they're they're very lightly drawn. There's not a lot of detail to these people that we're following. There's
Hmm.
not a lot
Hmm.
of information and context. There's not really characterization, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this stuff is left vague intentionally, but people might not connect with that. And I think by the
Hmm.
end of the movie, when we saw it, I could tell, like in the theater, there were some people who just didn't like it. And a lot of people won't like this movie and won't necessarily connect to it and gravitate towards it, because it is kind of moment after moment, these extreme actions and scenes of violence, which can be really hard and tough to swallow. But I do think that it has something to say just about, obviously, the state of the world, the state of journalism, and what the role of journalists play in conflicts,
Hmm.
in war, and then just also our own perceptions to those things and how we view those things on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's a really, really tremendous film, and I do think that it's probably his best work thus far, at least from a filmmaking perspective. I hate that he's probably not going to direct anymore. I know that
I
he's
know. It's
kind of been
sad.
he's kind of been beaten down by the industry. I know it's not great, and he doesn't really enjoy it as much as he probably thought that he did, or probably he initially did. And if he at least sticks to writing, that's great and that's fantastic. But he's a really visionary filmmaker, and I would love to see him obviously continue and do more work. I do want to ask a follow up though, just about A24 putting out this movie again. As I mentioned, this is their most expensive movie, $50 million. It also got a full IMAX rollout. They worked directly with IMAX to bring this movie out. And a couple of years ago, A24 talked about this transition that they're making to make more big budget driven films, just because their company is growing. They kind of have to. A couple of years ago, they raised $225 million to expand its production and distribution arms and operations. So that was the first big step to get them to another level, and also just surveying the state of the industry. Low level, small indie films just aren't doing well. And they've put out
Hmm.
a number of those films that just haven't done that well. People don't go to see those things, especially in a post COVID world. It's really, really difficult already to get people out for these bigger budget tentpole films. The small indie joints don't really stand a chance. And so they see that things have to change, with this being their first real effort, with Civil War kind of being that launching pad to get them as a company into making more big budget movies. How do you feel about that transition? Because we know them to be tastemakers, and their
Hmm.
choice and selection of films to distribute and sometimes produce has been impeccable. And a part of me kind of wonders if they may lose that in going after bigger budget movies. But I don't know. How do you feel
Mm-hmm.
about that somewhat of their essence might be kind of lost because these movies are just going to naturally grow bigger as the company grows bigger? Or are you on the other side that you kind of have faith that they'll continue to find these visionary filmmakers, these director driven projects that they can, sort of scale up and make bigger while still maintaining that sort of indie spirit and that vision that they started out with?
Yeah, I think I am. I think I'm part of the latter, and I think Civil War is the first good indicator for me that that's the case. Again, Alex Garland. If you've seen his previous films, he is just his movies are not normal. The man does not necessarily have normal films. And I think that was one of my worries coming into Civil War. Not that Alex Garland wouldn't stay true to himself, but this being a bigger A24 budget movie would kind of cause, oh, is A24 as a studio going to have to start getting things involved that they didn't before because they're a bigger studio, or certain sponsors going to be asking for certain things? You know what I mean? I just didn't know what it would be like. But after seeing Civil War, this very much feels like an Alex Garland movie to me. I feel like the artsiness, auteurness of Alex Garland as a filmmaker and A24 still pretty much maintain here in this big budget film of Civil War, and I think this is one of the a good very early outing for the concept that they're going for, and so I'm pretty hopeful that they'll continue to again find these story driven, really interesting films and directors to really helm some of these things. I think I part of me thinks like they might just use like some of their, I don't know if older is the word, but yeah, some of their more, somebody who they work with in a lower budget film and give them the films that are a bigger budget. I think that's a cool idea because I think they'll maintain like the whatever the director's vision is while just making bigger budget, just a crazy director with a bigger budget. And yeah, and I think it'll go down like that. But yeah, right now I don't see them losing too much integrity, becoming again a bigger entity in this realm. So I'm gonna go with the latter and say again, just for right now with this showing with Civil War, and I'm gonna throw Bo in there too because Bo was kind of, you know what I mean. I think we might still be in good hands with A24.
There's always a fear that as these companies grow and expand, that they might lose their essence of what made them special to begin with, especially just in the ever changing landscape of Hollywood. Things are changing so drastically, so quickly. What Netflix started off as is very much different than what Netflix is now. And for me, I like the old Netflix. I'm gonna go with that adage. I like the
Hmm.
mid 2010s era of Netflix. When things were, they weren't small. They weren't really ever small once they really got going, but there certainly wasn't the oversaturation of the production that
Yeah.
they've just poured out over the number of years. And I think that they've noticed that, which is why they're scaling back now. A24, they certainly, it's the one entity, it's the one brand that's always got my trust, for the most part. And it feels like that they'll always maintain, what brought them to the dance to begin with, what made them special and
Hmm.
different than all of these other distributors. And this is really just an effort to scale up, and scaling up doesn't mean that we're going to completely change our identity or go after things that we normally wouldn't pursue. It's really just an effort to provide bigger platforms and bigger opportunities and bigger resources for filmmakers. I think you need filmmakers that have had that experience to take on budgets of these size. I don't think you want to throw in a novice filmmaker who hasn't worked on a project and really learned the
Exactly.
trade to get there. And I think that they realize that, like Alex Garland, super seasoned. I think he could certainly
Yeah.
handle what was presented to him here. And I think that they have other filmmakers that are traditionally in their camp that can take on those projects if they want to give them 50 million, 60 million, 75 million. Like, we're not still talking about $300 million pictures at this point. And so it's still at a level that, they can grow and they can become a bigger and more formidable force in Hollywood while also still keeping the essence of who they are. And certainly Civil War, it's proven to be a good experiment because it was number one at the box office this past weekend, had the biggest opening for any A24 movie ever. A little bit over $25 million at the box office, landed at number one. It was presented as a big spring tentpole sort of picture, that people had to go see. Now, of course, it's not making, big IP driven money. But I think that that's a really solid start. And if this movie is, doing what I think it's going to do, it's going to have decent legs and get a lot of people talking and having conversations about it. And they can continue to, have that momentum into their next future projects. And so we'll see what the next few years sort of shape out to be for A24. I'm very excited for what their journey is going to be. But folks, those are all of our thoughts on the brand new film Civil War. If you've checked this out, hit us up and let us know what you think.